This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is good, bad movies. Movies that are so bad that they actually give some sort of pleasure in watching them. And the conversation will be with Daniel Budnick, and it will begin in a moment. Daniel Budnick is my guest. He's been on at least 2, maybe 3 times before, talking about different aspects of pop culture. And on this episode, he's flying solo. And as I mentioned, we will be talking about movies that are so bad that they actually have some goodness in them. He runs a website called Some Polish American Guy Reviews Things. So welcome, Daniel, for those people who don't know you or your website or who have not seen your prior appearances on this show. Can you give a little background about yourself?
Of course. Yes, I have that website, Some Polish American Guy Reviews Things. That the latest thing I reviewed on there was the 2nd season of BJ and the Bear. Did that in-depth episode by episode. And I'll be starting the 3rd season soon, for anyone who's worried. I also, from 2006 to 2014, I wrote for a site called Bleeding Skull, which is a horror site. And, well, not all horror, but mostly weird movies and things like that. And we actually had a book published in 2013, Bleeding Skull, a 1980s trash horror odyssey. And I recently had my 2nd book published, which was 80s action movies on the cheap through McFarlane, which covers 1980s low-budget action films, about 300 reviews, covering from 80 to 89. What else do I have going on? I'm on several podcasts. I do one with my friend Amanda Reyes and my friend Nathan Johnson called Made for TV Mayhem Show, where we talk about made for TV movies. I have one called Eventually Super Train, which it covers short-lived TV shows. Right now we're covering The Green Hornet from 1966, The Immortal with Christopher George from 1970, and Ellery Queen Mysteries with Jim Hutton and David Wayne from the mid-70s. And we go episode by episode, and I bring on different guest hosts to talk about each show. And then I have one more called Dan's Drive-In Double Feature. And there are 2 versions of that. There's either a themed episode where I discuss a double feature, like recently we did winter slasher films like Iced and Moonstalker. I'm about to do one on Star Wars ripoffs. We're doing Star Crash and Star Odyssey, things like that. And
did you ever see? By the way, did you ever see that movie with oh God, the guy from the Herzog films, the German fellow? Name slips my mind. Yeah, he's in something called Creature. Did you ever see Creature?
I have seen a long time ago. Yeah, I remember that being a hoot. I haven't seen that since, but yeah, he was also in Android, which was a pretty good film from like '82 or something. And the last thing, the offshoot of Dan's Drive Double Feature, they folks are doing this thing now where they have podcasts where they go through movies minute by minute, and each episode covers a minute. Okay. And I specifically, because people choose movies like Jaws or Back to the Future trilogy or Star Wars, I specifically chose 2 of the most strange, slightly inert films I could think of. One was called, the first one I did was 1 Minute with Night of Horror. I think I might actually have, I don't know if you can see it, but the video box right here, 1 Minute with Night of Horror. And nothing happens in this movie for 72 minutes. Literally, almost nothing happens. So I went through minute by minute, and it was a lot of fun. A lot of folks really enjoyed it. And right now I'm finishing up a Minute to Dismember, which covers Doris Wishman's slasher film A Night to Dismember. And people really seem to like it. You go through these ridiculous movies minute by minute and tear them sort of apart, frame by frame, shot by shot. Folks seem to get a kick out of it. So.
Well, I'll probably contact you. I know I told Amanda this a month or so ago when I met her that I'm probably sometime early next year, by spring at the latest, want to do a show on telefilms, TV films. So I'll probably contact you then. And you had me thinking of Linda Day George, the wife of Christopher George, and has a boy. Oh my God, she was gorgeous.
She was. Oh yes. Oh yes, Mission Impossible.
And I remember she was a daytime game show staple on all the $10,000 pyramid and whatever it was. But just so people know, I want to just say I'm going to be using 4 lists to get some of the classic names. One is from a website called The Ringer. They have a list of worst movies. Then there's the Ranker.com, and then there is Rotten Tomatoes, their own list. And then Wikipedia has a list of films considered the worst, but that has mostly the so good it's bad type thing. And I want to also say that we're not going to be talking about bad films. For example, some bloated Steven Spielberg, Michael Bay, Ron Howard kind of films. We're not going to be talking about necessarily Euro trash films from the 60s and 70s. I'm talking about like Salo, the infamous shit-eating film, and we're not going to be talking about something like The Human Centipede, which is just going to try to be gross out and try to. We're going to be talking about films that at least an argument can be made that there was some sincerity, that these people were trying to put something out there, but they failed so utterly and totally and completely that it would have in the 1980s ended up on Elvira or the MST3K kind of thing. So first off, with that in mind, what do you think defines what we would call films that are so bad that they're good?
Well, I will say the one thing with that term, so bad it's good, is I myself use the term weird films just because I made up my own term for it. But it's the same thing. I'm going to use the so bad it's good terminology. But I think what it is to me is that it's a mix of, it can be as basic as telling a story in a way that it just seems like it's never, you tell. I just having mentioned Doris Wishman, her film A Night to Dismember, the way she tells that story, and there were reasons why she told the story the way she did, but the way she tells the story is you watch it and you go, has Doris never read a book or seen another movie? And it's so glorious because the best of these, you never know what to expect from minute to minute. And there's always, some of them, there's some directors who folks try to throw up, say like Al Adamson. I like some Al Adamson stuff, but I find him more dull than anything. Someone like Ed Wood, or someone like Doris, or obscure like Rene Martinez Jr., who made Super Soul Brother and Road of Death. They just to be so bad it's good. You have to have a constant something happening, something weird going on. So like Manos, every few minutes it does something weird. And just when you're at the point where you can't look at Torgo anymore and you can't watch him take the suitcases up to the room, you get inside the room and the room is weird. And then the movies are constantly sort of doing just something every few minutes that's so unlike anything you think films are supposed to do, that it becomes glorious and it becomes this wonderful thing. And it's every aspect. It's not just sort of shady acting or editing or story structure. It's when everything can sort of coalesce. And near the end of this, I don't know if this is on one of the lists, I can mention one of my all-time favorite movies like this that I have a little story that goes with it, but I'll bring it up later. But I think it's something where there just has to be a feeling like either this person has never watched a movie, or this person doesn't know how to make a movie, or they're from Mars or something like that. It's just there's just a beautiful excitement, and like you're watching a vision, but not from a visionary. Maybe just from someone who's a little cuckoo.
Yeah, and I think that probably the term or the idea of so bad it's good probably coalesced in the 50s and 60s drive-in era, I think, because you were getting these films just to have the second bill on the double bill. And it seems to me that the 50s sci-fi double bill era was where this idea of so bad it's good came about. Is that correct, or do you think that it went back to the silent era?
I think, the tricky thing with the silent era is that pretty much everything that exists is in some way or another worth watching. I think the stuff I'm sure there was tons of crap from the silent era, but it hasn't survived. And I mean, I would say I can go to the 30s with like Dwayne Esper, the guy who made Marijuana and How to Undress in Front of Your Husband and Maniac. He was making crazy films at that time. And then there are I mean, you have folks like, and I'm actually a big fan of his work, but a director like William Bodine, who made films in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, up until his last films were, what was it, Jesse James Meets Frankenstein's Daughter and Billy the Kid versus Dracula. And he was a guy, they called him One Shot, because he only did one take, but I can't actually find the proof of that. That was kind of a legendary name for him. I've seen maybe 40 of his films, and he's a very he's not he's not like watching one of the best doing he's not Kurosawa.
Yeah.
He's just a guy who he knows where to put the camera. He knows when the edit should come in and that kind of thing, and everything's competent. But he has some moments, and some folks sort of consider him to be a stinker. He was in, what was it, the Son of the Golden Turkey Awards back in early, or was it Golden Turkey? It was Golden Turkey when they did Worst Director. He was one of the nominees. And there are films like, I'm sorry.
I didn't say anything.
One of my favorite films that's just kind of, I don't even know, I call it a sheer audacity film, because you sit there and you watch it and you go, how did they think people would not get up and leave the theater doing this? There's a film called Devil Monster from 1946, and the basic plot is it's like a seashore town. A well-known guy gets lost at sea, so a bunch of people get together on a boat and go after him. And it's presented as being, they go from sort of like South Sea Island to South Sea Island trying to find him. The movie's about 63 minutes, and I would say, it's been a few years since I watched, that about 35 minutes of it is stock footage from the 20s of like National Geographic style stuff.
Yeah.
So it's like you get 5 minutes of people saying, okay, we're gonna go visit this island. And then you just get 10 minutes of footage of people on this island, and the guy's kind of going, we talked to the chief, and he told us this, and the chief didn't tell you anything of the sort. And it's just great, because you watch it and you go, oh my gosh, how did they think people would not just go, I'm out of here?
Yeah, that you just brought to mind, in the 40s and 50s, stock footage, and there must have been at least 3 or 4 dozen movies, and you'll know the footage I'm talking about, where they have lizards with the sailbacks to make them dimetrodons, and then the earth moves, breaks up, and then the 2 lizards fall off. It was used in 1,000,000 BC, and then everything up until the like early 60s, when you'd have a total break in just the quality of the film, and you'd see this crap. Do you know what movie that was originally from? Was it 1,000,000 BC?
I want to say it was the original 1,000,000 years BC, the Hal Roach one with Lon Chaney Jr., I think. I forget the year, 35 maybe. I believe that's where it's from. Yeah, you could see it, like there's a Bird-Eye Gordon film, I think it's Bird-Eye, called King Dinosaur. I believe Robot Monster, and like the psychedelic sequence near the end shows some footage from it. Yeah, that was just like, that was everywhere. Yeah, that was great. I mean, it's, like stock footage was one thing that there's... One more film from the mid-50s, there was a film called Jungle Hell, starring Sabu the Jungle Boy. And that one, it's supposed to be set somewhere in India. It's an hour-long. UFOs show up, and about 20 minutes of it is stock footage of stuff from India and the jungle. And so you just sit there and it's like, oh, that's crazy. But I think you're right. The 50s, really, when you start to get the films like Invisible Invaders and the Giant Claw and Beasts of Yucca Flats, films which are being made specifically to go at the bottom of the bill. I think that's the point where you start to get people, we're getting sort of interested in how screwy these films could be.
One of my personal favorites that I only saw as a child, and I think I've seen it maybe once in the last 20 years on something, was From Hell It Came, about this walking tree. Some native islander in the Pacific or something is killed by the white man, and then he regrows as a tree and comes back. And it always amazes me, these monster movies where the people are running at full bore, and these lumbering things somehow all is behind them. That's
great. From Hell It Came actually just came out on Blu-ray
from
Warner Archive. And the guys who made that made The Phantom from 10,000 Leagues. And The Phantom from 10,000 Leagues doesn't look as crazy, but it kind of is. It's one of those films where, like, people, instead of having a conversation like, well, what did you find? It's a dead body. Well, how'd it die? Something to do with radioactivity. It'll be something like this. What's over there? What do you mean, what's over here? Look right there. And the conversations that should last 4 lines go on for 2 days. And you just sit there, and it's just astounding. But yeah, I think you're probably right. The 50s, and then the 60s, when sort of gore hit, and you got your nudist colony films. Then I think things went up to another level. And then the 70s, when sort of like regional horror really took off. Went a little higher, I think.
Well, and that's true. I think sci-fi and horror tend to have been the domain of most of the bad films. And we'll talk a little bit later. I mean, in this century, The Room has become sort of the Plan 9 of the the 21st century for a lot of people. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. You mentioned the 1930s and these sort of Maniac and these films where I guess they were deliberately trying to violate the new Hays Code, and in doing so, they went so far trying to show human deviancy in some way. Reefer Madness is probably the most famous film in that genre. Other than the Reefer Madnesses and the cocaine and what was some of the, I guess you call classic bad films that showed the horrors of, that from prohibition or drug use or that?
Oh gosh, it's funny. Those are sort of the main ones I know off the top of my head. There was one. What is that? There was one. Oh, I'd have to look up the title. Something with children in the title. There was one that was basically about eugenics and trying to sort of cull folks. I forget what the title of that one was, but it's like they were mostly about cocaine and marijuana. What else were there? Things like a favorite if you're a Mystery Science Theater fan. I Accuse My Parents. Let's see. What were some of the others? It was like the hygiene films, like the Kroger Bab kind of things, like what is it, Mom and Dad, where they inserted the actual like a scene of a woman giving birth into it, and they would separate the men into one tent and the women into another tent, and they would like sell pamphlets and there were of course there were VD films. There were weird. What's the one? A Child Bride. You would get these weird films that you watch going, where are these things from? Where it's like this 14-year-old getting married off to this older guy, and it's just this. There were a whole slew of them. It's an area I'd love to sort of go after more. The personal hygiene films, things like that, and of course. You had a lot of great, but this was a little later. Well, no, during the World War II and such, you had a lot of great, horrible, like VD films that like the soldiers had to watch and things like that, which were just horrible.
There's a famous bad film from either the late 50s or early 60s that was put out. I don't know if it was by the U.S. Health Department, but it's about homosexuals driving around cities trying to pick up young men.
Oh yes,
I forget what it's called, but it's like, and
it's really,
it'll be like, and the homosexual has his known ways. Beware of the homosexual.
Yeah, it's something. It's not. I don't think it's like the molester, but it's something like that. Where you hear the title and you go, "What?" And then you watch and you're like, "Are you kidding me? That's crazy." Yeah. I remember. Is that the one? Because there's one where there's one where like a little girl, they like entice a little girl into a car, and then the last shot in it is like a creek or something, and you just see this little girl's body in the creek, and it's just like, oh my god, this is horrible. What the hell is this? I'm gonna have to check into that.
Well, you mentioned World War II, and it seems to me that most of the bad films of World War II were just blatant agitprop, so you can't. I don't think you can really lump them in. I did see one German film recently online, which showed Mickey Mouse, Popeye, and Bugs Bunny driving or flying airplanes, dropping bombs on Germany, and they were supposed to be representative of the evils of America or something. It was kind of really bizarre, and of course they didn't care about copyright infringement, of course, but but the late 40s, I guess, is where the birth of this was, and I think it probably coincides with UFOs because there was such a slew of alien invader films, and we think of the great ones, the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, or what was the one, the Day the Earth Stood Still, and whatnot, and you have later stuff like Forbidden Planet, which is about going out into outer space. But there were so many ones about. There was one I remember, First Man in Space, I think it was called, where he comes back and he's like encrusted in rock.
Yes, and you get like Devil Girl from Mars, where the woman comes from Mars to is it like a Scottish village or something with a giant robot? She wants to take men back to Mars for procreation, and Catwomen of the Moon. There's Catwomen on the Moon. I always get that wrong.
Yeah, that was an Elvira pick.
I saw that in 3D a few years ago. It was great. The 3D, there's a moment where a spider drops into the foreground, a giant spider, which actually you see just these hairy legs sort of lower into the frame, and it's like, oh, that's awesome. The rest of the movie is very silly.
Yeah. And so that would, of course, bring us up to, you'd mentioned Ed Wood, and Ed Wood is, I guess, the archetype of the good, bad director, immortalized in the early 90s in the film Ed Wood, played by Johnny Depp, directed by Tim Burton. And the two most well known of his films are Glenn and Glenda, which he dealt with his, I guess, bisexuality, or maybe he was just a transvestite, and then later, of course, Plan 9, which is, I guess, the archetype of the good bad film. What do you think about Ed Wood? I mean, do you subscribe to the idea that he really was as demented and thought he was actually doing masterpieces, as some people claim?
I think I kind of do think that. I don't know if uh, I don't know if I go demented, but I do think that he really was. He thought he was making great movies, and his budgets and his talent just fell a little short. However, he has that flair for the really weird dialogue, and he's just willing to. He does that great thing where he's just willing to, if it's okay if the doctor's laboratory is clearly just like a piece of drywall with like Rick painted on it or something like that. He's okay with that. He's okay if the octopus doesn't move. Bela Lugosi is going to jump around on that octopus, and it's going to be great. I just got the feeling he really wanted to make movies. He was very enthusiastic, and every time he got the chance to put his vision out there, he gave it his all. Now his all ended up generally being pretty weird and wonderful, and obviously the fact that folks still know and love his work, and even just Orgy of the Dead just came out on Blu-ray, which he only wrote, but in every aspect of that movie you can hear in his dialogue and Criswell, and it's pure Ed, and I'm a huge fan. He's not, as far as like all-time favorite sort of crazy directors of this sort go, I would put possibly someone like, say, Doris Wishman a little higher, just because her filmography is much more extensive and much just weird. But yeah, I do like Ed. I think there's something sincere and charming about what he does, and his films are all watchable, which works.
Yeah, and if let me just pull up his filmography here, because I mentioned Glenn and Glenda and Plan 9 here, but he has only a handful of films here. Let's see. You're right. He only has maybe about 10. Jailbait was another famous one. Bride of the Monster, Plan 9. The thing is, I think that makes Ed Wood, well, you talked about visionary, is like Plan 9, just to use that as the most famous one, it has the solemn intonations by the narrator at the beginning, is this real, blah, 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 and you actually see the guy talking, and then you have when Lugosi dies midway through the filming, the guy, who's not a vampire, just walking around with his forearm covering his face, and then we see, Tor Johnson acting as a zombie, and not that different than Tor Johnson acting. And then we see not Elvira, but Vampira, who was the inspiration for Elvira, somewhere in there, and they're just watching, and then you get, some of the famous sequences, the cop scratching his head with a loaded gun, and that kind of thing. It's just, there are so many moments like that it couldn't, even if it would take so long to think that badly rationally, that it had to have been something that just came to him as he was doing it naturally.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's all from his mind, and that's the great thing of it is when you get these really wonderful directors, they're constantly surprising you minute after minute by doing something that, like the scratching his head with the gun, or just having Tor Johnson as a cop who comes back as a zombie. It's just like you see these things and you go, I don't know if I would have loved to have spent an hour in Ed's mind. But it would have been interesting to see as it went along. If some of the things were like the scratching the head with the gun, I'd love to know. Was that in the script? Or Ed said, just scratch your head, and he scratched his head with the gun, and they couldn't do a second take, or just it's as I said earlier, one of the things about the best of these sorts of movies is every few minutes, or less than that in the best of them, something happens where you go, what? Why is that happening? What's going on? And it's so great, and they sort of accumulate into this sort of gorgeous mess that you can watch over and over again, the best of them.
In the 1950s, probably the biggest rival for Plan 9 as worst film of all time, or good, so bad it's good, is Robot Monster. And that was directed by Phil Tucker. And I'm just looking up Phil Tucker. and he actually edited The Nude Bomb, which was the Get Smart film in 1980.
Get out of here! That's a fun film.
Yeah, I can't. He was the editor on that, but Robot Monster is another one of those things that nothing seems to make sense. It follows the whole trope that it ends up as a dream, but then is it really a dream when we see the monster come out at the end again? What are your thoughts on that film? Because that's another film that is in the so good it's bad category. Or so
Robot
bad
Monster.
it's good.
Robot Monster was one of the first films like this that I saw when I was a kid. I think I taped it off of like WPIX out of New York City at like 3 in the morning or something like that, because I heard it's got a guy in a gorilla suit wearing a diving helmet, and I just watched it and I just sat there going, "What is going on?" And I saw it a couple of years ago, actually with the double feature with Catwoman of the Moon. I saw it in 3D, and surprisingly, for being made for like $20, the 3D is pretty good in it. And I love it's one of those movies that, again, I don't know where Phil Tucker's mind came up with this. I think that the gorilla suit and the diving helmet, that was of necessity. He just wanted something alien, so it was like, hey, this guy's got a gorilla suit. Okay, well, put a diving helmet on him. You got it. And just the rest of it is just this. It's this. Unlike Plan 9, which gets sort of dreamy and weird, but feels like it could be in like an alternate reality. Robot Monster is sort of like a stream of consciousness, just like we're over here, we're over there, this is happening. Roman is pontificating again to himself on the screen. The little kids are running around. The gal's getting her top torn off, and it's this flow of they're living in this like burnt out basement, and it's like. What?
I know. My favorite moment is when he has his little soliloquy after he's been rebuked by his superiors for showing some kind of kindness. He's like, am I good? Am I not? If I am bad, shall I do this? If I do not do this, they will destroy. It's like attempting to have a Shakespearean soliloquy in the middle of this crap.
With a diving helmet and the bubble machine.
Yeah.
So, it's I love some of the films. This is close to sort of a Doris Wishman style, just flowing from bit to bit, and very much like now we're here, now we're there. What's going on? And you can just barely keep up with if you can keep up actually with what's happening. Sometimes you just got to dive in and just let them do to you what they're going to do to you.
And it's interesting because I think in the late 50s, with the rise of AIP and Roger Corman, we got sort of a transmutation of the so bad or so good it's bad films from strict sci-fi, if you will, if you want to call it Plan 9 or Robot Monster strict sci-fi, to sort of the sci-fi surfer kind of mixed film. And Phil Tucker directed a thing called The Cape Canaveral Monsters, which I haven't seen for many years.
I've not seen it, yeah.
But it's basically the typical thing. Teenagers go out on double dates. Near NASA's rocket launches, invaders come to take the women back to their home planet, kind of thing. And there are so many of these perfect kind of drive-in movies where you have dumbass teenagers, aliens or monsters or something rampaging around. In that vein, is there any one or two of those alien sci-fi / surfer flick kind of things that come to your mind, other than the one I mentioned?
Well, I was going to say the one I always like is Invasion of the Saucer Men, with the little guys with the big heads who get destroyed. Spoiler, by pointing lights at them of any kind. And that was just like, just off in the woods, a bunch of kids hanging out, and all of a sudden these little tiny aliens show up, and they have to, and the cops don't believe them, and they have to deal with them. And I like that one because that apparently I've read somewhere that was supposed to be a comedy, but you wouldn't really know it from watching it, although it might be just from how goofy the aliens look.
Yeah.
But that's one, whenever I think of that's one that always sort of grabs me off the top of my head. And then you have stuff like, although this is the end of the 50s, like the giant Gila monster, which is just about a bunch of teens. One who works in the main guy works in like a auto repair shop, and he's constantly pulling out a ukulele and singing songs about rainbows. And there's a giant Gila monster breaking into like kids partying in barns and things like that. They're not quite as hip as the kids surfing and the drive-in and stuff, but you got to start somewhere.
Yeah, I was just looking up one of that came to mind, 1964, The Horror of Party Beach. Does that ring a bell to you?
Yes.
Yeah,
I love that.
That's a classic surfer monster. It's not aliens this time; it's monsters. But
the toxic monster, the chicken monsters with the hot dogs in their mouth. Yeah, that one's great. I do like that guy, Del Tenney. He also made Curse of the Living Corpse with the
Yeah.
woman who was in Carnival of Souls. That was a
Oh,
lot of
okay.
fun.
And was he the guy who also did, what's the one with the crabs that you can see the wheels on them, the crab monsters?
It's Attack of the Crab. That's a Roger Corman one.
Oh, that's Roger Corman. Okay.
That's
Yeah,
actually that's a lot of fun. Yeah.
yeah. And just looking here, by the 1960s, well, Beast of Yucca Flats is actually
Oh
61,
yes.
and Coleman Francis is another guy who, like Ed Wood, is considered a genius of the so bad it's good movies. And the thing with that movie is, it nothing is synced up. It was filmed silently, and you have this ridiculous intonation of a narrator over everything. Again, you have Todd Johnson just walking around as a
doing his best, like Lon Chaney Jr.
Yeah,
Lenny
a
from
post-nuclear
Like,
mutant of some sort, but actually it just looks like Todd Johnson. You know, when you have Todd
With a
Johnson, you
little
don't have to
on his
have the
face,
bigger
yeah.
budget. You know,
Exactly. The moment Tor shows up, you know what area you're in. Yeah. No, I love Beast from Yucca Flats. The three Coleman Francis films was Skydivers, Red Zone Cuba, Nitrate Mondo Fine, aka Nitrate Mondo Fine, and Beast from Yucca Flats. I'd love to see a lovely 3-disc box set of that come out, because those are so. He's one of those guys. He just like he was hanging around Hollywood. He was a bit player here and there, and he just made these 3 films, and they're so. I love them. I think they're just nuts. They're just so much fun. And another film that came out around the same time as Yucca Flats, The Creeping Terror.
Oh yeah.
Also was one where, like, what is it, like 75% of the soundtrack was lost.
Yeah.
And so you'll get a scene where everyone's on screen talking live on screen, and then it'll suddenly go into, well, Steve got in his car and he drove down and he looked at his wife and said, "How are you, dear?" And it goes on, and it's great. It's great.
And the 1960s, I think, saw the beginning of the indie film movement in America, and so you had a lot of indie sci-fi films. There's a film that I had on VHS years ago, and I think I might have gotten it on one of those back in the early O's of this century. You'd get those like 40 or 50 pack sci-fi films that were, on DVDs that were maybe for 10 or 20 bucks. And I forget the name of it, but I think it was something like Journey Through Time from like 66 or 67, wherein they go back through time and they go to a future Earth, and of course there's an apocalypse, and it's sort of a ripoff of The Time Machine. But a lot of those films were just bad. There weren't really the humor or the fun that you had. Another movie that I'm just looking at here, Ega, with Richard Kiel, and this is long before he played Jaws on James Bond here. That's also a fairly well-known film. Do you have any comments on that one?
I like Ega. You gotta love Arch Hall Jr., the star, the ostensible star of that film, breaking into his songs, trying to make him into like the next Elvis or Fabian or something like that. Not quite working. And the guy who made that, they also Arch Hall Jr. was also in a film called The Sadist, which is actually a really quite good film as opposed to Ega, where Richard Kiel wears a glorious big fake beard mustache, and the cave where he lives is clearly just like a room with fake rock on it. And it's I like Ega. It's not it's wandering slightly into that realm of like the Al Adamson, Ted V. Michaels kind of stuff, where I like it, but I don't love it. It's not quite crazy enough for me, but there is certainly enough stuff in Ega to keep it. It's actually, I hate to say it, it's actually almost better on the MST version, because they bring a little extra to it that just kind of makes it one of my favorite episodes of that show, actually.
Yeah, and I feel the same way about like Santa Claus Conquers the Martians. I think if the little girl hadn't been Pia Zadora, I don't think it would have gotten the notoriety. But it was in the early 80s or late 70s when her old husband, the millionaire, bought her the Golden Globe Award for whatever it was. I think that sort of resurfaced this movie in the 80s, 20 years after it was made. It's a cute little movie. It's not good. It's not. It's a bad movie, and it has a few interestingly funny moments in it, But why it surfaces on these lists, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that movie?
You know what? I usually every year I'll do Santa Claus Conquers the Martians, Santa Claus, the Mexican film from the late 50s, double feature. I like Santa Claus Conquers the Martians is one that I'll put it on, and then I sometimes will do other things as it's playing because it's fun, but it's so studio bound, and
Yeah.
it's so kind of like locked into these small rooms throughout. It definitely has its charms. Not a favorite. I prefer the Mexican Santa Claus because it's just nuttier with Satan and the devil and Merlin the magician helping Santa out and everything like that. I'll go for that. That's what I love.
Yeah. Now I'm just looking at some of these lists, and just going to zip through some of the more famous ones, and we'll talk a bit more in depth later on other aspects. But see, one of the things listed here is Myra Breckinridge from 1970.
Oh,
But now that's not a good film, but I don't think there's anything particularly funny about it, and it's got actually good cinematography in it and whatnot. So it's not so bad that it's
yeah.
funny. And when I see that, I can see it being on a list of bad films, but I just don't think people could really put that there.
Yeah, I think that's one of those. Now I haven't seen Myra Breckinridge in probably 20 years,
Mm-hmm.
but I just remember it being okay. It's kind of outrageous and this, that, and the other thing, but it wasn't one that like I watched and said I need to show this to people. I was like, okay, I saw it and carry on. Some of the films on the list I think are going to be like although I haven't seen this in a while, say like Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
Yeah.
I saw that a few times when I was younger. And I don't know that I need to see it again,
Yeah.
but sometimes that'll pop up on these lists. You know, like although this is a little more fun, like Sextet, the Mae West film.
Yeah.
That's kind of nice and goofy, and there's something camp about that. But yeah, some of these films on there, I just feel like some of them might be holdovers from like the Golden Turkey era, where like Myra Breckinridge was big in there, and you know what's a great one? I don't know if it shows up on this list. I saw on Turner Classics like a year or so ago is Skidoo with Jackie Gleason and Carol Channing, the Otto Preminger film,
No, I don't
where
know.
he's a convict, and it's basically Otto Preminger and these older character actors trying to be very hip at the end of the '60s and not really succeeding, but it's screwy.
Yeah.
So.
Well, the end of the 60s, I talked about how sci-fi morphed into sort of sci-fi horror surfer girl stuff. By the late 60s, the whole surfer girl Gidget kind of fad sort of became easy ridered, and we got a lot of sort of hippies, biker type versus this, you know, I guess you could say at the end of that cycle of in the mid 70s with I guess Leatherface and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but you had things like Last House on the Left and whatnot. But most of those films, which are basically slasher gore or proto slasher films, are bad. But again, I don't think they really rise to the level of being so rewatchable. Do you?
I think there are a few in that era. The end of the '60s, start of the '70s. I love. Now, I'm a big fan of Herschel Gordon Lewis's The Gore Girls, which was his last regular film before he went off for a while. But there are some films like now I'm a fan, and I wouldn't call these so bad they're good films, but I am a big fan of like a lot of the '70s sort of low budget proto-y slasher type films like Headless Eyes, Psycho from Texas, Scream Bloody Murder. There's a double feature. Director Leonard Kirkman made two films in the early '70s, Carnival of Blood and Curse of the Headless Horseman. Yeah. Both of those are not what one might call good, but I saw Carnival of Blood on the big screen on my 40th birthday, and it was a hoot. It's so much fun to watch. And Curse of the Headless Horseman is just basically, it purports to be a horror movie about a bunch of hippies who go to like a wild western town, and there's a headless horseman there who's flinging blood from the head at people. But really, it's like the producer had a bunch of friends who were hippies, and he wrote a script based around them and got this guy to direct it. And it's literally, of the 80 minutes of the movie, maybe 40 minutes of it are just these hippies hanging out and like doing comedy routines and doing bits that you think, okay, these are in jokes that I don't quite get. And there's something fascinating to me about something like that. But the early '70s era is tricky because there isn't a lot of stuff that I would call so bad it's good, and like horror and stuff. I think there's a lot of very interesting stuff. It's when you start to edge later into the '70s that things begin to, even Werewolves on Wheels, you know, as much of a ripoff as it was, the werewolf only shows up right at the end, is actually kind of a good, strange, psychedelic, weird biker film that's decently made sort of in that genre, where it's kind of half improvised, half what the hell's going on.
Yeah. Let me just get back to the 60s because I jumped to the 70s there. But a couple of films I want to talk of. Well, a type of film that are often put up for these best worst kind of films are often foreign films that were just mutilated either by AIP or Japanese imports and whatnot. I remember the War of the Gargantuas, which I don't think is that bad of a film. Which was basically started out, I think, as Frankenstein meets something or other. And these came in the wave of the King Kong versus Godzilla. They wanted to bring that in. And then also you had, from Europe, you had a lot of films, especially from Russia. For example, you ended up with a really pretty good science fiction film, which was made first into Journey to the Prehistoric Planet, and then became Journey to the Planet of Prehistoric Women. I think it was Planet of Storms was its original name. So are there any standout films that were competent films in their original thing, but were just butchered to the degree that they became unwatchable, that come to your mind?
Huh. That's a good one. I may need a moment. It's tough to say with some of them, but there's the director, Jerry Warren. We used to get like the Mexican films. Yeah. Like there's one with Lon Chaney as a werewolf, which I think was actually a fairly decent. It's actually a comedy with like a sort of with a werewolf, and it has like it has an ending like on scaffolding, Harold Lloyd style, on the side of a building. But when Jerry got it, he cut out all the comedy and he threw in some random other scenes, and you just sit there watching it. It just seems so dull now. But I believe the original was more energetic and more fun.
And you mentioned people like Lugosi and Lon Chaney. I guess we could put them in the category of fallen Hollywood stars, and that, of course, brings to my mind Joan Crawford. Post Betty Davis, she did a film where she's the mother who's released from an insane asylum after 20 years, comes back to visit her daughter, seduces the daughter's boyfriend or something, and she just goes totally bonkers. It slips my mind.
Is that Berserk or which? I forget.
I'll have to look it up here, but
okay. And she made, what was it? Troglodyte was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Are there any other big name actors or actresses that you can think of that sort of fell in their final decade? As I'm looking up Joan Crawford's filmography here.
Well, there are those weird Mexican films Boris Karloff made, like Jack Hill at the end of the '60s, right before he died, like The Fear Chamber, and that's the only title I remember off the top of my head. But it's like they would basically he'd be in a room in a wheelchair, and they shoot like 5 minutes of footage of him, and then string it out into an entire movie. And I think there were like 4 of them right at the end of his life, if I remember correctly.
Okay, no, it was Straight Jacket.
Straight Jacket. Okay.
Straight Jacket, 1964. That
William Castle?
It was William Castle. Let's see, because it's a series of axe murders. Let's see, William Castle. Yeah, and William Castle is one of those guys, producer, director, who did a lot of those, like what was it, The Buzzer or something about the little creature that crawls up your back.
The Tingler, yeah.
The Tingler, yeah.
He had the shock things, the little buzzers in the seat, and House on Haunted Hill, the skeleton would fly out over the crowd, and what was it, Mr. Smith? Oh, I'm sorry. No,
I was going to say, and William Castle, those films are not good, but most of them had someone like Vincent Price, and I'll tell you, I'm a Vincent Price fan, and I think he's one of the most underrated actors of all time, because when he's in, even in the most absurd situations, you believe that he believes it. And when you get that, he was a good enough actor that could sell it. Whereas the actors in an Ed Wood or Coleman Francis film are just not capable of doing that.
Yes, yeah. No, I agree with that. The William Castle's like House on Haunted Hill is, and that and The Tingler are probably my favorite of his films. Some of them are just kind of in that slightly bland realm where you sit there, like Mr. Sardonicus is okay, but the fun of that is the will he live or die thing. And apparently, he never shot the he will live ending because he knew people would always say, let him die.
Yeah.
So.
Well, we mentioned earlier, just to get out of the 60s, Manos, The Hands of Fate. What are your thoughts on that? Because that is a film that I think it rivals Plan 9 in terms of people saying it's so good it's bad. but to me, it never had the fun factor, the laugh factor that Plan 9 does.
It doesn't. I think Manos. It's tricky for me because I have the Blu-ray of Manos, and I probably watch it once or twice a year, and I really like. There's something about the fact that before we knew how it was made, there was something that it just looked like this strange snuff film shot somewhere in the middle of Texas. But now that we know how it's made, and we know it was by a guy who didn't know what he was doing, taking a bunch of people out into the middle of nowhere and just shooting stuff and then piecing it all together. It's actually, I kind of prefer before I knew what was going on. The sort of the mystery of what the hell is this is big. But I think the thing with Manos is that unlike Plan 9, which I think keeps a constant flow of Manos is constantly nutty throughout, but the thing about Manos is it has a few too many moments where it's sort of it looks like, okay, I don't have enough footage, so I'm just going to sit right here and the gals are going to fight for another minute because I need this to be another minute longer. Or Torgo, we're going to get his entire walking with the suitcases. I'm not one of those. One of those things you always hear people. Well, I've heard people say is, I think Joe Bob Briggs first said it, is a movie can be anything but boring. Yeah. And to me, I don't agree with that. I think a movie can be boring if it's doing something interesting. But if it's boring, there are going to be moments when it's just not doing something interesting. And Manos, I think 75% of the time, I love it. The other 25%. It's exactly what it is. It's him filling up time to make the movie longer, and that doesn't bother me. But it's not as fun as Ed's craziness.
Yeah, let me bring up a sort of subgenre of this so bad it's good film that I've rarely heard or seen on these lists. And having grown up in the 1970s and having watched things like In Search of with Leonard Nimoy on TV, this would what I would call the pseudo supernatural documentary. Eric Von Däniken and stuff, Ancient Astronauts, In Search of Bigfoot, this or that. In the early to mid 70s, there were dozens of these movies that I remember as a kid. I did a show called on the lost film culture of this country, where the theaters would be open 24 hours. They'd play the main features from noon to midnight. Overnight, they'd play porno. In the early mornings, they'd show old reels of cartoons or Jason and the Argonauts. And occasionally, you'd get these, films of pseudo documentaries, and there were so many of them that were just so what the fuck bad. It's like you would get and in 1927, Jack Porter was in a cabin with his friends in British Columbia when he was attacked by and then you see bad things, and then you'd hear boom, 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 the totally bad effects, the bad actors there. They're doing what is now fills up 90% of cable back 40 years ago. But did any of those ring a bell with you? Those kinds of films?
Oh, I love those. One of my favorites I have right here. I don't know if you know this one. Overlords of the UFO. This is a movie that purports to tell us, proof the ETs have found us, and they're not all friendly. Yeah. And this is one just like some portentous guy standing in a room saying, at the end of this movie, we're going to show you who the overlords of the UFO are. Yeah. And when you hear that, they don't fully define sort of what that means, overlords of the UFO. And the movie is just basically 90 minutes of footage that you've probably seen in other documentaries like this, put together and like given something. You'll see an interview, and then you'll see the person being interviewed saying something like, "Well, UFOs have been around forever," and then it will cut to the host with a microphone in his hand, clearly not in the same space, going, "Well, tell me, what do you think of this?" And then it'll come back. And I love Overlords of the UFO. You put Bigfoot in a movie, I'm in. There's a faux documentary called Sasquatch from '76 that I just love, and it's like 8 or 10 guys going deep into the Pacific Northwest, and there are a lot of great like folk songs about Bigfoot, and there's the most ridiculous looking guy pretending to be Native American, and it's just so much fun. Yeah. And there's that. There's what's the one In Search of Bigfoot, which I just discovered recently, which is an actual documentary. The host of it is a guy who made a great mid-'70s regional film called Bloodstalkers. Yeah. And he's this little bald guy. He's just like, we're going to find Bigfoot. We're going to find Bigfoot. And there's that one. There's one called The Force Beyond.
And they were all narrated, it seems, by guys like Rod Serling or John Carradine or Leonard Nimoy or some of these actors who were in down periods in their career.
Yeah, well, it's funny. The funny thing with Rod Serling, in that he sort of, there's a film called Encounter with the Unknown, which came out in like '73, and it's an anthology film, but it's a really weird one. I recommend it to folks. It's a little slow here and there, but it's really interesting. But the big thing is narrated by Rod Serling. The odd thing is there are actually two narrators. One guy whose voice I don't recognize, and then every once in a while Rod Serling says like 3 sentences.
Yeah.
And so it's like narrated by Rod Serling. And the thing with Rod, though, at that time was he was teaching at Ithaca College. So he was actually doing quite well. I don't know why he chose to do this film, but he did, and I love it. Because,
well,
but no, I'm sorry.
I actually interviewed Rod Serling's daughter, and while he was teaching there, from what I recall her saying, I don't know if it was on camera or off, I think he was in debt over certain things due to Twilight Zone, and then he had the later anthology series, which apparently bombed, and he had some piece in it and something. So I think he had. So I think there were financial issues for why, and more than likely they probably borrowed that from some lecture he did about something and just spliced it in, but. That documentary, by the late 70s, that little subgenre seemed to give way to sort of the exploitation genre. Things like Mondo Cane, I Spit on Your Grave, which was sometimes quasi-documentaries, sometimes not, but which were filled with gore. Or what is the one? Faces of Death, I think, was around that time, too. Yeah. And so these are also films that I think, generally speaking, are just terrible films, but unlike Plan 9, you kind of enjoy them not because of the humor of them, but because they're so audaciously trying to be out of bounds, and they succeed, but they're so ineptly out of bounds.
Yes, yeah, they'll mix like actual like footage from the news or something like that with the scene with the guy in the electric chair in Faces of Death, which is clearly fake. And although I don't think I knew that when I first saw it when I was 12, I think I was pretty convinced. But now I watch it, and it's like it's always like Faces of Death was one of those things. I grew up in the '80s, so circa '83, '84. That was when we first got our VCR. It was like I would say to my stepdad, we gotta get Faces of Death, and he'd say, Danny, I'll look into it, and it was, you start to get that strange thing, like the I Spit on Your Grave, almost sort of cinema verite kind of, if you will, kind of take on rape revenge, and then the Faces of Death, and then I'm trying to think, in the '80s, Faces of Death was the big one. It had its 3 main sequels, and then you got some other weird things would pop up. Like there was a film called Inhumanities, which purported to be like a Faces of Death kind of film, but was really just like footage, like from Devil Monster. It was like footage of just like National Geographic footage of like cannibal tribes and things like that. And it was purporting to be like these horrible, look at this horrible thing this woman is doing. She's eating maggots out of a head, because they have this one shot like this woman sitting there and she's putting something in her mouth, and then it cuts to like a skull with maggots in it, and a hand reaches in and takes a maggot. But apparently that's not actually what was happening. She was just like eating rice or something like that, and they just cut in this shot of the skull with the maggots in it with like a hand reaching into it, and it's just hucksterism at its finest.
Now, the '80s, I'm just looking at some of these lists. They often include what would be considered box office flops, which are generally not the best movies, but to me aren't so bad that they're good. They list the usual suspect: Mommy Dearest, Ishtar, Howard the Duck, Superman: The Quest for Peace. And for example, Mommy Dearest, I think the acting in that is actually quite fine, and I mean it's got some over the top moments, but I've never understood why that's been singled out as such a bad movie. And Howard the Duck, okay, that had bad effects and whatnot, but generally speaking, it's competently made. I mean, what 1980? Because the 1980s seemed to me to be a period where there weren't that many all-time so bad it's good films. Do any stand out for you? Are they the Bruce Campbell type, or the knockoff was Bruce Campbell films? Any of those kind of stand out to you?
I mean, there are quite a few things like like I mentioned earlier, Night of Horror from 1981 that I did the podcast about. That is, like I said, 72 minutes of nothing, literally nothing happened. And then, I mean, I think the thing with the '80s is that I'm a big slasher fan, so I give a lot of leeway to slashers. I think it's as the '80s went along, and you started to get more direct-to-video films, that's where things start to go cuckoo.
Yeah.
With films like Sledgehammer, which was the first, which is more or less the first shot on video for home video release, or a film like Boarding House, which was shot on video, transferred to 35 mil, and shown on big screens. But most of the time in the '80s, there is a lot of crazy stuff, but it's not quite something I think you'd see, like if you went on a list like that, you'd have to sort of here, another of my favorites, Blood Lake.
Mm-hmm.
Blood Lake, shot on video, I think it's in Oklahoma, 1988, and it's literally just like, I just dropped it on the floor, it's literally just like a half a dozen late teens going to a house in a cabin, and they spend the first hour of the movie just hanging out. There's a sequence in the movie where, the game Quarters, where you hit the quarter on the table and it flips up into a glass? There's a sequence where they play Quarters after dinner. It goes on for 5 minutes. And the camera just sits there looking at them as they're playing Quarters. And at one point during the scene, there's a cut, and they're still playing Quarters. So they play Quarters for like 10 or 15 minutes, and we're getting the best of 5 minutes of it. And you just watch stuff like this, and you go, the reason they're able to do this is because it's going direct to home video. If you were to show this to a crowd in a theater, they'd be like, okay, 2 minutes and Quarters is enough for me, and they leave. But I think in the '80s, when you start to see it slide into sort of different, I think you're right. The '80s, when they pick the big So Bad It's Good films, they're big flops.
Yeah.
Whereas there are a lot of strange films, but you have to sort of hunt for them in the '80s.
Well, I mentioned earlier Creature, which was a direct knockoff of Alien, and it seemed to me that a lot of the films that were made low budget in the U.S. or in Europe, as Creature was, were direct knockoffs of superior Hollywood films. Yes. Like The Thing had the '82 version, Carpenter's version, which is a good film on its own, I think, had knockoffs. And then you had, in '78, you had the what's his name? The Nimoy version of Body Snatchers.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And then that had Body Snatcher knockoffs, and some of them have had variant quality. Another one is what's the Roddy Piper film? They Watch or They?
They Live.
They Live, yeah. Things like that, which are clearly inferior knockoffs of better made and films with better ideas. Are there any of those sort of knockoff horror or sci-fi films that stand out to you in the '80s?
I just thought, since we mentioned Linda Day George and Christopher George earlier, what about Pieces? You go to classic Pieces from the early '80s. I have, you don't have to go to Texas for a Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah.
It's exactly what you think it is. The premise of it is that a little kid in Boston in the mid 30s or mid 40s, his mom finds him putting together a puzzle of a naked lady. So she kind of beats him, and he kills her with an axe. And 35 years later, at a college in Boston, through an event that happens, he begins to assemble a woman out of body parts. And it's made by the guy who made Slugs and When Time Began and Endless Descent and Pod People, which was a Mystery Science Theater favorite. And it's super gory, and it's a Spanish production shot mostly in Boston, and so it's all post-dubbed, and it's crazy, and it's very much a Friday the 13th, Halloween, Chainsaw Massacre style thing, and it's a joy. It's one of my favorites. It is goofball to the extreme.
And I think those knockoffs have an advantage over, say, the 11th version of Freddy Krueger, in that the Freddy Krueger or the Jason or all of those Halloween, they have a certain formula. They're sort of fixed, whereas the goofier knockoffs can start off, but in that vein, but then they just derail in totally novel ways.
Yes, yeah, I agree. Yeah, I'm trying to think of right off the. I'm not thinking. I'm not getting. I will say this, and this isn't a knockoff per se, but I was just thinking. What film follows on from a well-known film that is absolutely screwball is Howling 2, Your Sister is a Werewolf. I don't know if you've seen that one.
No.
But Howling is pretty darn good. Howling 2, Your Sister is a Werewolf is Christopher Lee and Red Brown and Celia Danning, and they go to Transylvania, and all the werewolves are having sex, and there are midgets everywhere, and it's just crazy. And you watch it go, where the hell did this come from? And that's a sequel, but that's still in the same.
Well, speaking of midgets and number 2, of course, 1990 saw Troll 2, which isn't really a sequel, but this is a film that, especially in the last dozen or so years, has been propped up along with Ed Wood and the Coleman Francis and Manos as an arguable candidate for best worst film of all time. And I actually saw an interview with the filmmaker. I think it was an Eastern European guy, and he's totally crazy. He actually thinks this is good. And I mean, maybe it's because the 1950s, because they're in black and white and they use such like flimsy sets. It doesn't quite get there. But what are your thoughts on this oft-cited candidate?
I like Troll 2 quite a bit. I think it has that thing where every couple of minutes it just does something where you watch it, you go, what the hell? Whether it's the sister doing her dance in the beginning, or how is the little boy going to stop his family from eating all the food? To just the fact that they're goblins, not trolls, and that witch woman who gives one of the more eccentric performances possibly ever in the history of cinema. I do like it quite. It's not one I watch that often. It's made by Film Mirage, which was Joe D'Amato, who's Italian. That's not his real name. I can't say his real name. It's very long. That was his company, and they made a bunch of films in the sort of the Florida, Louisiana area, and they made Ghost House, Witchery, Metamorphosis, Troll 2, Beyond Darkness, and they're all a lot of fun, and I actually prefer a couple of those to Troll 2, but there is no denying that there's something about Troll 2 that's really screwy.
Yeah.
Is it my favorite? No, but it's definitely, I think it's a good one that you can show to a crowd, and they'll be constantly entertained by it. But it's not my favorite, but I think it's fun.
The 1990s, probably the most well-known film that's often thrown up there, even more so than Troll 2, is probably Showgirls. But to me, that doesn't cut it as a so bad it's good, because, number one, it was directed by Paul Verhoeven, and even though it's a bad film, technically speaking, in terms of the shots and the cinematography, it's simply not that bad. And the actresses in them, Elizabeth Berkley isn't good, but I think it's Gina Gershon is in that, and she's passable in her role. So that's another one of these films that I just don't understand why people think it's that bad. I mean, it's like they've never seen the Troll 2s or the Plan 9s when they say that. It's bad, but...
To me, I saw it when it came out. I thought it was more sort of camp than anything, and so that didn't. Camp's in another realm for me. It's Troll 2 is. I got the feeling that they were. I mean, I don't know the background to Showgirls, but someone in there wasn't taking something seriously. Yeah. So that's the feeling I got when I watched it. So it wasn't quite the same for me.
How about? I've never seen it, but another candidate, a big budget candidate, is of course Battlefield Earth. I've never seen it. It's the John Travolta travesty of the Scientology. I've seen clips of it here and there, probably about 8 or 10 minutes total of that movie, and it seems horrible. But have you seen it, and would you put it in that so bad it's good category?
You know what? I haven't seen it because when I was young, I read the book. And having read the entire 1,000-page book, I thought I can't go see that movie. And maybe I will one day. But unfortunately, I don't have much to say. The book, I don't really recommend.
Yeah, and I'm just looking here in the O's, the 2000s here. Another candidate that's often mentioned is the Mariah Carey film Glitter. Then you have Justin to Kelly, the first American Idol film. What do you think about those? Because it seemed to me that there were a lot of poor musicals, and that some of the names, I think there was one with Jessica Alba in it, too, that she did some musical. Do any of those stand out, or are they sort of a blur?
We're starting to wander into the realm of stuff like that, where I'm just like, I don't think I can do that. I've seen a few minutes of Glitter and thought, well, this isn't that great. I thought maybe if I watched the whole thing, I'd go, oh, I get it, but I only saw a few minutes. And from Justin to Kelly, I couldn't I couldn't get myself to watch.
Well, I want to talk then about a film that was one of the reasons I wanted to do this film. I think when I contacted you a few months ago, I just watched it for the first time on a streaming service, and that's, I guess, this century's biggest candidate for best worst, and that's The Room. I'm just seeing it says the Citizen Kane of bad movies, some critics have called it, and I watched it, and I have to say, I found it to be a bad film, a dull film, but in terms of, say, some of the editing competently made, for example, there's those scenes on the rooftop. It wasn't until the second or third scene that I realized that it was green screen, because it actually, you get a kind of sense of it. And to me, that just, yeah, there's the famous, Lisa, Lisa, and then, oh, hi, Kevin, and, those famous clips that everyone sees. What was your thought on that film? Because for me, it's not in the Plan 9 or Troll 2 or Monos League, because it has some competence in it, and it's just kind of boring.
Yeah, the thing with The Room was that I first heard of it, I think, what is it, 2002, 2003?
Yeah.
I think, and there was a record store called Aaron's Records in Los Angeles. I think it was on Highland and Santa Monica. And one day a billboard just appeared that said, "See the Room," and there was a big picture of Tommy on it. "See the Room,"
Tommy was
captivating experience or something like that. And I just kept seeing that billboard. It was there for a year or two.
Yeah.
And I just kept seeing it going, what the hell is that? What is the? And it was literally maybe 5 or 6 years later before someone was like, "Oh, The Room, it's kind of this crazy bad movie." And so I sat down and watched it about 3 or 4 years ago. And I guess the best way to describe it for me is, I thought, like you said, I thought some of it was very competent. I think Tommy is, you know what? There's a film that's more fun that just came out on DVD from Intervision called, is it Beyond the Seventh Door, I think, or Journey to the Seventh Door? It's a low-budget Canadian film where a couple are trying to break into this guy's house, and they go underground into the series of, like, puzzle rooms to try to get there. And the lead guy in that reminds me of Tommy. I prefer that movie, actually, too. I think it's either Journey to the Seventh... No, Journey to the Seventh Plan is what I'm thinking of. I think it's Beyond the Seventh Door. But, I mean, Tommy's fine, and it's sort of like, you get the feeling of, like, some of these actors are actually pretty decent actors struggling with a script that is kind of clueless, and a director who is giving really weird, making really weird choices. I work about 2 blocks away from a theater that does a monthly screening of the Room. And I've been tempted just to see with a crowd, maybe if it would change my opinion. But I watched it once, and then I rewatched it like a year or so after that. And I haven't watched it again. I think I can see why people like it, because there is plenty of sort of quotable stuff where a crowd can Rocky Horror style yell along with it.
Yeah.
But I didn't. There are other films to go to, I think, that are far crazier.
Yeah, I think it has 10, 12 moments in the hour and a half or so it runs. I mean, the infamous football and tuxedo scene that comes out of nowhere, and then there's the scene where the young kid, they're all disappointed because he's doing drugs, and basically the drug dealer comes to kill him, and they somehow stop this drug dealer and act as if nothing happened. I mean, there are some funny moments there. But in between, it's just basically him bitching about this slutty girlfriend of his, and when I was like, okay, it's a bad movie, but I just didn't get the affection for it.
I think to me, I think you're right there, that it has these moments that are really wonderful, but then stretches in between, and it's one of the things when I was a kid and I bought the Golden Turkey Awards, is one of the things that Son of Golden Turkey do, and even 50 Worst Films of All Time, is when they're describing a movie, like, say, maybe a movie that has, like, an awful monster suit. Like, something like It Conquered the World with this giant, like, cucumber alien. They just go on and on about that, how bad those little flying bats are. And you know what? The alien does look pretty goofy in the movie, and those little flying bats aren't good. But you know what? The rest of the movie is competently written and pretty well acted. There's a good cast in that. So you go into it thinking, okay, this is going to be the worst thing ever. You saw that monster, and then you watch it, and the monster's in 3 minutes of it, 4 minutes of it, And so you get those moments where it's like, oh, there you go. But the rest of it, you sort of have to deal with as being something other than what you expected it to be. And you can either, like in The Room, get a little bored when Tommy goes on, or like it Conquer the World. Like the third time I watched it, I was like, actually, this is pretty well made. And I can get over the monster in the end. So I think that's my thing with the film.
There are films, and there are some films that I have seen on bad films lists and so bad it's good films lists that when I've watched, I said, no, this is actually a pretty good film. My favorite all time, I think it was 1957. I think it was a British AIP film called Abominable Snowman with Forrest Tucker.
Oh, sure, yeah. Nigel Neal wrote the script.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's actually a pretty good film. It treats the natives of Tibet as intelligent creatures. They're not just the Asian stereotype. Forrest Tucker is a guy who's looking to capture the creature. There's a scientist there. I mean, is it the greatest film or the greatest sci-fi film? No, but at the end, there's an avalanche. We get the sense that there's a Yeti culture or whatnot. It's actually a pretty good film, and I've never understood why some people have really slagged on it.
Yeah, I haven't seen Abominable Snowman in ages, but I remember really liking it. It's a Nigel Neal script, so it's going to be, you've got your intelligent basis right there. So and at that time, Hammer was Hammer, right? Was that,
it might have been Hammer. Yeah, maybe.
I forgot.
Yeah, I think it was. Now that you say it, yeah.
They were doing good, and that was right before they went full on into the horror. This was around the time of Curse of Frankenstein. So it's like it's on the cusp of the Quatermass films are over.
Yeah.
And the horror is about to start, and it comes right in that little spot. Yeah. And I think I remember it being a good film. Not one I've really gone back to, but I can't see why you would get so angry at it.
And just to get back to The Room, it's interesting. From that time when it was made in 2003, there came another subgenre called mumblecore. And I recently watched this 3 or 4 year old film on Netflix that my wife wanted me to watch called Frances Ha. And that's just a really bad film, and yet a lot of critics have applauded it. It's black and white. It's muddy in that there's almost no differentiation between the lights and the darks and whatnot. And I was thinking to myself, this isn't even as good a film as The Room, and yet it's poorly acted. It's the lead actress is this one of these Hollywood intentionally quirky millennial types that all she says is and there's a lesbian subtext in the film, and it's like I'm thinking if you put The Room and this and had the same people watch that without telling them which was the so bad it's so good film, maybe it's 60-40 to The Room, but Frances Ha is not that good of a film, and I'm that's one of the reasons that when I watch The Room, it's like it's not that much worse than a lot of these bad mumblecore, as they call.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I recently saw a film that I need to watch again. But have you ever seen Trash Humpers, the Harmony Korine film? He of Gummo and I'm blanking on his other films, but Trash Humpers is shot on video. Came out like 3 or 4 years ago, and it's basically a bunch of people wearing like old people masks, and it's tough to describe. But they go around, they start off, and they pretend to hump trash cans, and they get involved with a strange like conjoined twin and a tall old gentleman who wears a tutu. And a weird kid in a tuxedo who stands in the middle of a field smashing a doll with a hammer. Mm-hmm. And I sort of watched it. It's about 74 minutes long. It almost it could have been maybe 10 minutes shorter. But it was just one of those films where I don't know what he was trying to do with it. I kind of really loved it, but I also kind of thought, I hope this doesn't have some subtext I'm not understanding, because this just looks like people in masks humping trash cans to me. And so there's this weird word. I don't know if you call that bad. I don't know if you call it good. I call it interesting. Certainly, I can't imagine watching it with a crowd, or could I? I don't know.
Yeah. So to sort of just bring these all to a head and wrap it up. Now that we're here heading towards 2020. I talked about subgenres, sci-fi and surfer flicks, and then faux documentaries, and then the knockoffs of Hollywood films. Is there any I guess you call subgenre of filmmaking now that's going on. I mean, I've never seen something like Sharknado. Is Sharknado, are they so bad they're good, or is there sort of a wink and nod kind of intelligence to them? What's the latest subgenre that's going to produce another classic bad film?
That could be it. I think the trouble with that is that they're deliberately trying to do that. Obviously, when they're doing Sharknado, so it's sort of like the few of those silent films I've watched. They're amusing. They kind of do that thing where they outstay their welcome a little bit, and you kind of want you kind of wish that there was just maybe a little more intelligence behind it. It's like they come up with the great idea of the sharks and the tornado, and then they don't always fully flesh it out with as much other stuff as there should be, because we're seeing like the characters in it are characters we've seen since Friday the 13th and Prom Night,
and a lot of them are former TV stars we grew up with, and so it's we see so and so from this show. That actor was in the Gilmore Girls, or this actor was in 90210.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of those. I wish I was. There's so many of them, and when they're done right, they're very energetic. But I don't know why. Maybe I need to see the right one. When I see that sort of the right one, I'll go, there it is. I like the concepts of those more than actually watching them.
Yeah.
But apart from that, I'm kind of, I don't know where the next run would come from. Because they are still making a lot of like low budget films that you just watch and you go, ooh, this isn't so hot. But then occasionally you get one. There are a lot of found footage films are doing weird things too. But it's tough.
There was I think there was a minor subgenre after the Blair Witch. You got a lot of these shaky Steadicam films with legendaries that were made up.
And they're doing stuff now with like what there's that one I forget, it's Spanish film I think where it's about father and a daughter who go into this house to explore it in the middle of the night, and it's all supposed to be in one take. I haven't seen it. It's supposed to be really good. And then there's Albert Pune, who's made a ton of movies over the years. He did a film called Invasion, which is all from the point of view of like dashboard cams as like aliens are invading. I haven't seen that one yet, but there's still some interesting stuff going on, and I would think that when those go wrong, they'll either go wrong so boring you're asleep, or so crazy that it's astounding. But I haven't really delved too far into that.
Well, I think that a subgenre to be exploited is to go back to those 1970s faux documentaries, because when I look online on YouTube, there's so many channels. And about a year or so ago, I was for a few weeks looking through some of these YouTube channels on Bigfoot, on chupacabras, on UFOs, etc. And there are some of these guys who do these commentaries on this footage that's supposedly real that I think would be ripe. There's one guy whose name slips my mind, but he's like he's the equivalent of a Bigfoot apologist, that any footage that he sees, he can somehow find a scientific reason to justify. My favorite one was, you see this car driving, and you see, in modern cars now, because I have a 20-year-old car, but when I've driven for work, you have the cameras at the back, and you can see they put a little dash line down the middle so that you can know which side of the road is on. But there's this footage on YouTube of a guy backing up, and you hear the woman say, "Oh my God, I think we just hit it." Apparently they ran over a Bigfoot, and then you see like this Bigfoot get up, and they're going, "Oh my God, go, we hit the gun," and you see this Bigfoot running after them, but slowly the car is outdistancing the Bigfoot, and the guy is giving this quasi-pseudo explanation of this had to be at least 10 foot because of this or that. But if you look at the actual computer footage, the line is not in the road; it's the computer line, which means that it's only about 2 feet wide on either side, not 10. And so the person is clearly someone in a monkey suit, but he's giving this pseudo-scientific explanation that this is it has to be at minimum 10 feet and 485 pounds or something. And it's like, I would love to see someone bring back those kind of pseudo documentaries, either truly believing it, like this guy, or someone just spoofing the whole thing of all of these YouTube channels. I think that's a really ripe area.
Yeah, have you ever seen Amazon Women on the Moon in the mid-'80s?
I believe so,
There's
but years ago.
there's a bit
I
in
saw
that.
it. I saw it in the '80s. They had all those Elvira VHSs. I think if that was on Elvira, I saw it.
Oh no, this one was actually, it's a mid-'80s sort of a Kentucky Fried Movie tunnel vision style
Oh, okay.
sketch film. I think John Landis did it, and some other
I
folks.
may have seen
And
it then.
and there's a bit in it, an In Search of Ripoff called Bullshit or Not, and it's basically they prove that the Loch Ness monster was Jack the Ripper. And it's awesome, and I'd love to see something like that through footage, and it's all there. But I'd love to see something like that. That would be a lot of fun because I love that stuff. I love that stuff.
Well, just to wrap up, we've gone through genres. We've named some of the top 5 or 6 big name candidates. Are there 2 or 3 that you can think of, whether they're from the 30s or 40s or recently now, that have been overlooked? I was just looking here. In the 1940s, the Babe Ruth story with William Bendix, and I remember that movie. And I don't. It's not a good movie by any stretch of the imagination, but I wouldn't put it in the so bad it's good category. What films of yours do you think that you can toss out 2 or 3 titles? Would you say?
I've got a few right here. Let me do just. I'll show you this one. This is one called Devil's Express, starring Warhawk Tanzania. In the end of the movie, he's in the New York City subway in gold lame overalls fighting a 2,000-year-old demon. It's sort of a blaxploitation, kung fu horror film from the mid-'70s that I just loved to pieces. It's great because it starts off like kung fu, then it becomes horror, then it shifts into a cop film, then it's like a gang war film, and it just keeps shifting and shifting, and every like 10, 15 minutes it becomes a different film. And I just love it. It's out on DVD, and it just came out on Blu-ray, and mine's on the way. So there's one. Let me see. Wait a minute. You know what? No, not that one. Oh, here's another one from the 70s. I don't know if you've heard of this one. Duke Mitchell's Massacre Mafia Style. He's a guy, he made a film called Gone with the Pope, where two gangsters kidnap the Pope and ask for $1 from every Catholic in the world. This is basically the God. Duke Mitchell was in a duo called Mitchell and Petrillo. Petrillo was a Jerry Lewis impersonator, and Duke was a Dean Martin impersonator. They made a film called Bela Lugosi Meets a Brooklyn Gorilla, which came out directed by William Bodine, who I mentioned earlier. But this is Duke is obviously very Italian. And this is basically, if you could imagine The Godfather made for about $1,000 with this much talent, that's what this film is. It's super fun, and he keeps going off on tirades about Italians, and then they shoot people for like minutes on end. They'll just walk through halls shooting people. Oh, it's great. And then I'll give one more, although I could give tons of them, like Invitation to Hell.
Yeah.
This is British. It's 45 minutes long. It's awesome. But I'll do one more, and this has a little story that goes with it. This is one I mentioned earlier, and this is sometimes finding, you can stumble across a film, watch it, and not realize how wonderfully, sort of awfully gorgeous it is.
Yeah.
And this was one about 1995. I watched a film from 1988 made in Louisiana called The Last Slumber Party. I watched it at a time when I was watching tons of other slashers. I watched it and I was like, this one's kind of bland. I watched it again in 98 just for fun. And I was like, I don't know. But a friend of mine, Scott, and I used to, at this time, we would do movie nights. And we'd get together once a week and we'd show each other movies. And he would show me stuff like The Wild Bunch and The Searchers. And I would show him Microwave Massacre and Frozen Scream. We had a nice balance going. And I showed up one day with Last Slumber Party, and I said, hey, I've watched this 2 or 3 times now. I think there's something in it, but I can't tell. So I showed it to him, and he said, no, there's nothing there. And I was like, I felt like, So a year later, I watched it one more time, and I realized why I didn't see what was wrong with it, because it is a movie where everything goes wrong, from the script to the structure to the editing to the sound to the acting to the directing. Every single thing in the movie is so wrong and so off that you don't notice it when you're watching it because you're in this other space. And so I recommend The Last Slumber Party very highly. Earlier this year at Terror Tuesdays at the Alamo Draft House in Austin, Joe showed it and had the star of the movie there. And so they had this big celebration for it. It's I say Last Slumber Party, Massacre Mafia style, and Devil's Express, and throw Invitation to Hell on there just for 4 that I really love.
So if you were to pick, though, let's say if we had an all-time Razzies or Oscars or Golden Turkeys or whatever, but for good bad films, who would be the all-time actor that you would say you just have to watch 2 or 3 of the roles that they were in and you just love them?
Oh gosh, that's a good one. No, I might need a minute on that. What's yours? Let me take a minute.
Well, I would have to go, I think, with Tor Johnson because I mean he starred with both Ed Wood and Coleman Francis, and if you look at some of his other stuff, he's always Tor Johnson. He's always stumbling around, and he's just so Tor. I mean,
yes.
there's no mistaking him. I mean, Richard Kiel, yes, he's always Richard Kiel, and you can tell him anywhere, whether he's in a Twilight Zone episode or whether he's Jaws or whatnot. But he had a little bit of acting ability. Tor Johnson had nothing.
Yes. You know who I might. My first thought, actually, when you mentioned that, was maybe John Carradine, just because he's popped up in so many of these films.
But he's actually a pretty good actor. He's in The Wizard of Mars, which is
David L. Hewitt film.
Yeah.
Yes. I was going to mention Gallery of Horror.
Yeah.
Maybe by the same guy that he posed. I'm having a tough time. My first thought was Cameron Mitchell near the end of his career.
Yeah.
When he was, because when he would show up in stuff like The Demon, Frankenstein Island, the great crazy ninja movie Raw Force. There were just like if Cameron Mitchell showed up, you knew that there was going to be kind of a. It was funny with him. Sometimes he would give it his all, and sometimes, like in Frankenstein Island, he'd be barely awake.
Who was the guy in the 1970s who was in a lot of Doug something or other, an American actor?
Doug McClure.
Doug McClure, yeah.
I love Doug McClure. Yeah, he's great. The Virginian's one of my favorite TV shows. Yeah, Doug McClure. Yeah, he showed up in a lot of.
He actually could act, but his career somehow went awry.
And he starts showing up in like a lot of Jules Verne films.
Yeah.
Like that. Yeah. It's tricky with that. I mean, because my first thought, Tor Johnson is actually the perfect example for that. But I just keep coming up with good actors who are going through kind of rough times.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, like Aldo Ray, whenever he would pop up, like when Aldo Ray popped up in like Don't Go Near the Park or Executioner Part 2.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, Aldo, you were winning. Did he win an Oscar? I forget, but you were nominated definitely.
And how about for all-time bad worst director? I mean, we mentioned Ed Wood and Coleman Francis. Is there another person that forms sort of a trinity of? Can we name a third in that trinity?
I'm gonna say what's his name? I'm gonna say the man who gave us. I don't know if I have it here. Oh, Big Fat Crazy Ethel, Nick Millard. What is it? She's 250 pounds of maniacal fury. Nick Millard made a ton of films in the 70s. Almost all of them were an hour long, which is really weird. But it's nice because they're pretty much all gone before they wear out their welcome. He did a lot of sort of erotic, softcore erotic films. He did Criminally Insane, which is basically about a very fat woman who kills people who try to take her food away from her. He did a film called Satan's Black Wedding. He did a film called 357 Magnum, another called The Terrorists. And he's sort of a less crazy version, but still pretty crazy, of like Doris Wishman. But there are a lot of these weird faces and a lot of the weird choices of where to point the camera and a lot of strange storytelling ideas. And the great thing about him is that he vanished at the end of the 70s to the mid-80s. But then in the mid-80s, he started showing up making really cheap direct-to-video knockoffs of his other film. So he made a film called Crazy Fat Ethel 2, which was shot on video in his house. And about 20 minutes of the movie is from Criminally Insane. And he made a film called Dr. Bloodbath, also shot on video, about a crazy doctor who kills women who've gotten abortions. He did 2 called Death Nurse 1 and 2, and they're all about an hour, and they're all crazy. And so he has this great thing where he had an actual sort of proper career in the 70s, And then in the late 80s, early 90s, he just went into this weird shot-on-video realm. And I would say him, just because he's got so many, and just because pretty much I've watched like 10 of them, they're all super fun.
And finally, I guess, we talked about Plan 9 and Robot Monster and Troll 2 and sort of one. Could you narrow down, if you had to give out your all-time best bad film award, what movie would you give it to?
Oh, wow. Okay. Oh, gosh. Would you mind giving yours again, and I'll just have a quick think? That's a good one. That's a really good
one. My bias is towards the 1950s. I grew up in the 70s, so I would watch on Channel 9 and Channel 11 the whole creature features and the chiller theaters. So my bias is towards those movies. So I would probably go with a Plan 9 or a Robot Monster. It's on Monday I'd pick Robot Monster. On Tuesday I'd pick Plan 9, kind of thing.
Okay. All right. You know what I'm going to do? A film that this is an Italian one, and it's a film I've loved to pieces ever since I first saw it like 25 years ago, and I watch it probably once or twice a year, and that is Burial Ground, a.k.a. The Nights of Terror, a.k.a. Zombie 3. Came out in 1980. It's a super cheap but very charming zombie film where a bunch of folks go to this huge mansion in the middle of nowhere, and Etruscan zombies come to life and begin to kill them. And it is, if folks who you're watching, if you know the film, then you know the character of Michael, who is one of the creepiest characters ever. Mm-hmm. And so Burial Ground, I think, is a film that it has a lot of gore, and the gore is really good, if that's your thing, and sometimes it's mine. It has a great creepy score. It has an incredible location, and it has a group of the dumbest characters you'll ever see just doing such wonderfully stupid things. And it's one that I can put on and show to almost anyone. Like Last Slumber Party can be a little, if you don't catch the wavelength of it, it can be a little slow. But something like Burial Ground, within 5 minutes, people are hooked on it, and it's just super, super fun. So I would say that one.
Okay. Well, Some Polish American Guy Reviews Things is Daniel Budnick's blog. He'll probably, hopefully, appear on some future episodes that I have. So, do you have a final comment though on the genre or whatnot? And what are you going to be doing in the future? You mentioned some other projects.
Oh, yes. My second book had just come out. I'm actually pitching my third book to the same publisher, McFarlane, and I've sent them a bunch of different ideas. The sequel to 80s action movies covering low-budget 90s and like weird kids movies and some other things. And so I'm hoping that will happen soon. And yeah, I've got the podcast going good. We got the Made-for-TV Mayhem show, which I think is probably the most popular of the ones I'm on. Yeah. When this goes up, we will be a few days away from recording our November episode, which is an all-male stripper episode. So we're watching for ladies only and Lady Killers, which is all about male strippers in the 80s on TV.
Which brings me to mind that probably should have had some Dolph Lundgren or Jean-Claude Van Damme films.
Oh, yeah. We should have had some more action like Jim Cotta or something like that. Something super fun, yeah. Or we should have. I'll say this last thing. This is actually taking us to Hong Kong. But if you guys want to watch some of the weirdest films ever, Joseph Lai, or Lay, L-A-I, and a gentleman named Godfrey Ho, H-O, in the mid to late 80s, they made about 30 films. Very quick succession that all had more or less ninja in the title. Some of them didn't, but they were like Ninja Silent Assassin, Ninja Deadly Force, Ninja. I've forgotten all of them right now, but there are a ton of them. You look up Ho-Lai, H-O-L-A-I, and what they would do was they would purchase a film from China, from Thailand, from the Philippines, from Japan, and they would edit in footage of white guys, Australian guys, with like headbands that said ninja on them, fighting. And they would adapt, they would make up a news story, wipe the audio on the film they purchased, and they try to match up this random ninja footage with this film that they bought the rights to. And they're an incredibly weird series of films. Type in Ninja Silent Assassin. That will take you to Godfrey Ho and Joseph Lai, and you'll find like 20 films. You can see a lot of them online. And some of them are boring as hell, but they're just crazy. I mean, you get ninja. I mean, since when did ninjas like go for like yellow and purple pastel? You know, and they had like ninja headbands, and they would steal music from like you'll hear Pink Floyd, you'll hear the Miami Vice theme, you'll hear it. They're fantastic. I forgot why I went on that tangent, but I was going to pitch a book about them. But the Made for TV Mayhem. That new episode is coming out soon. And that's about it. Thank you so much for having me on, Dan. It's always a good time.
All right. Thank you.